everyone, and welcome back to another recording of Modernizing Operating Models. My name's Deo. I'm a principal consultant at On the Mark, and I'll be your host today. In today's episode, I'm joined by my colleague Joe, who's an associate director at On the Mark, and we'll be discussing change, and more specifically, behavioural change. So what hinders it, what helps it, and how to navigate it during organisational change. So let's jump in. So, Joe, I thought it'd be good to start off with a little bit of an introduction to who you are. I know that, like myself, you are a lifelong learner, and so you have studied change, you've researched change, and so it'd be great just to hear a bit about your background and your interests, both academically and professionally when it comes to change.
Bro, no worries. Thank you, Deo. I think how I kind of fell into this, because it wasn't necessarily a kind of planned thing. I think with a lot of these things, you just fall into it, don't you? But it all started off probably 13 or 14 years ago now, when I worked for an insurance company. I was working in business intelligence at the time, and we acquired another insurance company. And as part of that, I worked to help with the integration of the two organisations from a business intelligence point of view. And it meant thinking about things a bit differently. It meant thinking about how, these two organizations could adapt and keep the things that were great and change things that weren't so great and things like that. And it was really that got me into thinking about a bit more about how organizations actually work. And I guess part of that was actually the project management side of things, so just managing projects and things like that. Really enjoyed it. It was about a 3-year program in the end. Really enjoyed it. Wanted to do a bit more on project management. Learned an awful lot around organisations and how organisations work, and saw some really good examples and some really poor examples of things like communication and engagement and that sort of thing. And it was that led to me then doing a master's in occupational psychology. That then kind of ran in tandem with a change of industry. So I moved into the retail industry, did some project management work there. And then I moved into organizational design. So I worked in a process improvement and continuous improvement team. I have some fond memories, actually, because when I was first recruited from out of project management and into process improvement, it was because I was the people-y one. So I think historically in the team, they'd had a lot of quite technical, practitioners who were, really keen on using things like Lean Six Sigma and things like that to really think about processes from a very technical point of view. And what they were missing was actually something that thought about the human aspects of change and improvement and things like that. And that's kind of where I came in. Did that for a few years. And then we actually had a large scale transformation program, which is where I really kind of cut my teeth on operating models and, the things that we do every day in OTM. Then I had a brief stint in HR. I did some leadership development, talent pipeline, succession planning work, which was really, really useful. That's actually paid dividends in terms of the work that I do with like leadership cohorts in organisations now. Then I worked in wellbeing strategy for a while, which again has been really useful. It kind of sounds a bit kind of out there, but it's been really useful because it's enabled me to see, not necessarily see, but to be able to understand some of the more human impact on change and how to mitigate some of that and actually think about the well-being of the people within the organisation. And then, joined OTM. And it's nice to be back in organisational design and very, very much still keeping, people and the impact on them kind of at the heart of what I do, I think.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's great to hear. And I guess knowing you, I do know sort of how much you care about people. Really at that individual level, you're really,
Mm.
really aware of what's happening with and in the people that are around you. So yeah, really looking forward to hearing your insights in this conversation. So just to kick us off, again, just thinking back to your studies and what you've looked at academically, it'd be great to
Mm.
hear what you've learned about, what you've researched, what you studied when it comes to looking at change as a topic. So I know that you've got a good understanding of how change has changed over the last few decades, and so it'd be great to hear from you around that.
Yeah, yeah, of course. So actually, one of the things I forgot to mention is that yes, I did my master's in occupational psychology, so did an awful lot on change within that. Then I also helped to design and teach a postgraduate certificate in the psychology of kindness and well-being at work, and a lot of what I kind of focused my work on was around change and the impact of that on people. And so one of the things that I did and kind of wanted to teach my cohort was how change has changed, basically. So a lot of the older original models were very much focused on the technical side. It was all about systems, it was all about processes, and there was very much an assumption that people would simply just adapt to whatever the change was, and that was that. Certainly across the 1960s to 1980s, the social sciences more broadly became a lot more popular. So, you'll have heard of Kurt Lewin's model of change, where that concept of unfreeze, change, refreeze, which makes sense in that you want to kind of unfreeze something, do the change, and then refreeze it again. But it doesn't really take into consideration the people impact. Doesn't take into consideration the things that we would talk about quite a lot nowadays in terms of continual improvement and constant change and things like that. It was really in the 1990s that change management changed for the better, I think, and really started thinking about people. So that's when we had things like Kotter's 8-step framework, things like ADKAR, which is something that I did my training in, which is where organisations realised that, excuse me, they realised that actually if they don't engage people and get their buy-in, 9 times out of 10, that change isn't going to succeed, and they would have spent an awful lot of money on a change program that ultimately doesn't do what it needs to do. So, you know, the introduction of those frameworks and models and things like that really embedded in organizations just how important it is to get people engaged and pulling for information so that they can be ready and equipped to kind of navigate the change. So from a tooling perspective, we're thinking about things like comms plans. Sounds really simple now, but training, just making sure that everyone has the training that they need to be able to do whatever it is that the change is kind of stating, and the importance of leadership as well, and making sure that leaders are equipped to be able to manage and lead change for themselves and their teams as well. I mean, moving into this century, I think I say the advent of technology. Obviously, it's not the advent, but certainly the speed in which technology has kind of taken over the way that we work has meant that we can change things a lot more easily and a lot quicker. And whilst that's good because it means that businesses can adapt quicker and respond to market needs, obviously means that there's a bit of a lag between that and people. And I think where you've then got this gap between where change was a one-off planned event, moving to actually it's just this continuous cycle of change. It's managing that with people and their fatigue and resistance to change as well. And I think having data and technology to help with that has really kind of aided being able to do that. And so it's been a lot easier to think about actually how we're involving our stakeholders, how we're engaging them, how we, the question I always keep in my head is what's in it for me, and that's what I want to try and answer when I'm dealing with, speaking to organizations. Every person that's involved in the organization at whatever level, you know will selfishly, and rightly so, as human beings, will want to know what's in it for me. Why are we doing this change? What are the benefits of it? What are the what will I be losing from it? And it's kind of balancing that, and that kind of moves into how things are now, which a lot of it feels like we maybe take for granted a bit, but making change more human centered. Um, like I said, thinking about how people are engaged in change, how they experience that change, thinking about their well-being. Like I said earlier, change can be tiring. It is tiring, I'm not going to lie. And understanding how, by kind of creating a feedback loop to enable continuous change and improvement, and keeping people within that loop and allowing everyone to have a voice, that really makes it useful. You're getting kind of real-time feedback from people on the shop floor, the people that are doing this work every day, being able to get their feedback on what's working and what's not, and having the power, I guess, and the freedom to be able to make iterative changes is really important. And in a world where we talk an awful lot around diversity and inclusion, being able to hear from everyone, and have people have a voice about what isn't working for their organization, their team, themselves, is really important. And it's ultimately that will help to kind of drive and embed that change, really. So yeah, it's been a an interesting period of time. And it's I love how change has changed.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you so much for that very interesting history. And I think I really like sort of hearing how it was once upon a time this kind of high level thing, and as time has gone on, it's really sort of brought it even closer to us as individuals. And really importantly, I love that language of human centered change, because at every sort of organizational team change, you've got that individual that really has to go through that their own personal journey of change, and sort of navigate that transition. It's a question that's kind of come to mind as you've sort of talked through that sort of theory. How do you think that organisations have been able to respond in a way that the kind of focuses more on that human centred element of change?
I mean, I think a lot of it is around communication. I mean, communication, I've been saying it for years, like you can solve so many problems just with good communication. And I think by being open and honest about things, I think that's the most powerful thing. I think any employee wants to be trusted, to whether it's to do their work, to so one of the things that I've used previously, and that I tend to have in the back of my mind a lot, is the in the UK, we've got the Health and Safety Executive Management Standards. And so a lot of that talks around things like autonomy and enabling people to be able to have some kind of say over the work they're doing. And when it comes to things like change, making sure that they are included within that change. And so it's a case of being involved and part of it rather than having it done to them. I've completely forgotten what your question was now, Teo. Sorry.
How organisations are responding? Yeah.
Yeah, no. So I think going back to what I was saying about the formalisation of change management in the 90s, I think because organisations can see that resistance to change is a kind of transformation killer, if you like. I think they're much better aware at being able to either preempt resistance, and kind of understand some of the the nitty gritty bits around change that people might, not want to kind of get involved in. I mean, we talk about DVFR a lot, don't we? So the Beckard Harris formula with so the D is the dissatisfaction. I think that's so important just to be able to create, or it's probably not even about creating the dissatisfaction. I think it's about acknowledging the dissatisfaction, and that change, people aren't doing change for the sake of it. It's not a fun thing to do necessarily. There is a real reason behind why it needs to happen. It could be because market conditions, it could be because of a some kind of takeover. There's lots of different reasons for it, and I think if organizations can be quite clear about the business case for change and the need for change, and ultimately what would happen if they didn't do that, I think that is really important, to be able to engage the workforce in why it needs to happen. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, no, it does. It does. It sounds like there's that move from it just being something that's studied in the books, that organizations are
Mm.
really having to pay attention to what's happening, and using more human centered thinking to be able to
Mm.
support individuals as they go through change. So one of the things you just touched on was Beckhart's model, and you started exploring it using talking about dissatisfaction.
Mm.
I'd love to hear if there's any more about that model, or if there's
Mm.
any other models or research that you use when it comes to leading change programs.
Yeah, of course. So I guess because we do talk about it a lot, then I'll do a very short and sweet bit on DVFR. So this was originally around in the 1960s, actually, and then got kind of added on as these kind of frameworks generally tend to do, and is, as I say, something that we use a lot from an OTM perspective when we're talking to our clients. So the D, as I say, is dissatisfaction. The V is vision. So that's the what's the objective? What is it that we're trying to achieve here? And then your F is your first step. So what is it that you want to do? What is the first thing that you need to do? And the formula is that you have D multiplied by V multiplied by F. So dissatisfaction multiplied by vision multiplied by first steps is greater than R, which is your resistance. So being able to deploy, if you like, those three elements will essentially give rise to being greater than any resistance that you would be able, you would kind of feel from the workforce. Broadly speaking, you're always going to get people that are detractors, and that might be because there is a very personal element to it. It might be that there are people within organisations that just like to kind of play that character. There's always the kind of, I don't know what the phrase is, but you always get people that just want to complain because they like to complain, and you expect that, and that's fine. It's all from a psychological point of view, I always find it interesting to understand why people like to play that, but I could talk to you about that all day. But yeah, I mean, it's change is a funny thing, and that's why the fact that it has become more human centered is a good thing, because resistance in itself is it's a very human characteristic. As human beings, we're naturally risk averse. We don't want there to be anything that rocks the boat. We've got quite delicate little equilibriums, and we don't want anything that's going to put that out of kilter. So resistance is a natural reaction. It should be expected. If there isn't resistance, something there's probably something other going on that we probably need to address. But it does mean that we need to make sure that any change transformation projects are really well prepared, really well supported, and we can give employees a really good solid reason as to why we need to do whatever it is that we need to do.
Great, thank you. Yeah, completely agree that idea of idea of resistance, because at a human level, I think our brains and our bodies are wired for survival, right? And so anything that threatens that is something that we choose to resist or fight or flight,
Yeah.
and so that can definitely show up as resistance. So just wanted to explore that model a little bit more and just maybe get
Mm.
some ideas about what that looks like practically. So looking at the different elements of DVFR, what type of things are we looking for, or can change leaders be thinking about when it comes to each of those elements of the model?
Mm. Um, so I guess with if we focus on our dissatisfaction first, question number one, is the dissatisfaction within the workforce high enough, or does there need to be some kind of work on understanding what the level is, and if you need that to be recognised as being great enough to warrant a change. So it might be that a lot of things might come off the back of employee engagement surveys, for example. So it might be that actually, for whatever reason, I mean, you're always going to get the same things that will come up as being dissatisfactory, unsatisfactory rather, for employees. So you're always going to have issues around car parking or hours or holiday allowance, all the reward stuff. But actually, is there something coming up around? I don't know. I don't have a good example, like leadership or whatever. So it might be that actually that can act as quite a good kicking off point to drive a dissatisfaction that could help you with the business case and the rationale for her change. Sometimes you need to almost create that dissatisfaction. So what we would want to do there, so my advice would be that you want to focus on the elements within the system that are suboptimal. The things that are just really annoying. The really inconvenient things that are just a pain, because you always have to do a workaround, or there's always some kind of hold up, or whatever it is try and focus on some of those things that are really painful and annoying. The things that when you're chatting to someone in the coffee line, or getting water or whatever, it's those little conversations that you have about such and such not working particularly well. Those are the really, really kind of key things to kind of pull and take from people, because those are the things that have that emotional connection. So yeah, in terms of that, it can be as much about the little things as the big things, i.e., we need to think about releasing capacity. We need to think about whatever it is, it's as much about the small things as it is about the big things. For our V, so our vision, obviously the change, any change generally will come from senior management leaders. But in order for employees to be able to accept it, I think there needs to be a really clear vision, a really clear objective as to what it is that the change is trying to achieve. What's the point? And some of that ties back into what I was saying earlier about the what's in it for me, especially if you think about it in respect to the dissatisfaction. Actually, employee, if we make A, B, and C change, the thing that's in it for me is that you get X, Y, and Z, and trying to make it as personal as possible. And recognizing that there are trade-offs. So actually, yeah, you might lose something, but actually you're going to gain something else. So there is something around, something around focusing on the wins and the gains rather than the losses and the kind of grief that can be associated with change. I think that's kind of vision. And then the first steps are really where your planning and your communication come in. So you need, once you've got your kind of objectives, then you need to think about how you're going to approach that, how you're going to make that first step, and making it quite a small but meaningful thing. If you do like this giant kind of leap from A to B, it's going to be really, it's going to create a lot of anxiety. And so, what's that adage about how would you eat an elephant? You'd break it down, wouldn't you? You'd eat it in chunks. So there's something around using baby steps just to prepare the way for change a bit more, rather than trying to do something instantly overnight, and things like that. And I think once you've addressed that dissatisfaction, you've kind of sown that seed of, actually, no, this is a bit rubbish, I want to make it better. Once you've sown that seed and you've said what your end goal could be, you've created that kind of utopian future, if you like, and then you've said, actually, these are the steps, and this is the very first step that we want to take. Once you've done that, that resistance kind of goes down, and you're like, oh, actually, yeah, I was not sure at first, but now that I've had all of those things explained to me and it makes sense, actually, I'm better placed to be able to get involved and help to drive that change. So yeah, I think, yeah,
No, that's
that's
great. Really,
DPFR.
really helpful just to hear some of that, and just sort of touching on the bit where you landed around resistance. In terms of what you've looked at, what you've studied or experienced, how would you describe or define how resistance shows up?
Oh gosh, in all sorts of ways. I think resistance, a lot of the time, there's lots of different ways of viewing it. Certainly from my point of view, and the behaviour that I've seen from people, it's very much driven by fear. There's a lot of fear of the unknown, fear of loss, the kind of grief attached to fear of loss, whether it might not be as obvious as loss of a job, like a whole job, we're talking redundancies, and reducing headcount and things like that. It could just be that actually someone has one kind of quite discrete element or role within their bigger job that they really enjoy, and they don't want to lose that, because that's the bit that gets them out of bed in the morning, or makes them stay a bit later if they want to. And actually, that shouldn't be underestimated, because it's those things that drive what we call discretionary effort in employees, which is where they go above and beyond what they actually need to do. And when you have that kind of, productive and engaged person or people in your organization, you don't want to lose that. So I think a lot of it is fear. So trying to manage that, but not not lying about it. You want to be honest about it, not sugarcoat it, but be factual. And if you don't know something, you don't know the answer, or the decision hasn't been made yet, that's fine. But it's a bit like, I know we've spoken about it before, Dale, actually, that I was unwell a few years back, and it was a case of, should I tell my son at the time, because he was only 4 at the time. And with kids, if you don't tell them something, they make it up in their own brains, and what they make up is almost always worse than the reality. And not saying that employees are like children at all, but I think if you don't have information, again, as human beings, it's the way the brain works. We will just fill the gap. If you're not being open and honest with people and communicating with them, then they will just make it up, and that made up version will be the worst possible outcome. So I think there's definitely something around being honest. But I guess in terms of how resistance has shown up in the work that I've done, we've had really strong detractors in the room who have, it feels like they've come in, thrown a grenade, and then legged it. You've got people that will try to, within the room, they'll be okay. And this is why it's really important to understand the organization you're working with, and get to really know the project team within the organization, because they're the people that will be able to spot detractors, and they'll be able to see better than we can as a consulting team what's happening in the organization, in those coffee queues, at the water coolers, because you get those people that within the room are playing by the rules, but as soon as they leave the room, they're just insidiously trying to undermine the process. and kind of saying to people, "Oh, that's not going to work. That's it's rubbish. It's not going to work." That kind of thing. And especially if it's someone who's quite tenured, they've been there a long time. They might not necessarily be the highest work level, but if they've been there for a long time, their opinion matters. And they can have quite a lot of sway. They can be quite influential on people that don't necessarily have a strong view one way or the other. Resistance, what else? Yeah, so you get some kind of insidious, covert detractors. Then you get some obvious, very overtly, this is rubbish kind of detractors. I mean, you get a lot of people that are just indifferent, kind of apathetic to it, and that can be almost as dangerous because that you don't necessarily know where they're at. You don't know necessarily what their influence or their sway is on other people within the organisation. It's fascinating from a psychology point of view just to be a fly on the wall and watch people in workshops. Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. There's all sorts though, Day.
Yeah, no, so good. And again, just sort of coming back to that human centered individual level. I'm sort of really hearing that the people's experiences, whether they've been tenured and been in an organization for a long time, whether things that feel small to them, that might sound small to everybody else, but actually feels really big to them. It's reminding me the importance of just really looking at things at that individual level, because that individual level is what's really affecting and shaping a system. So that was really unpacking some of Beckhart's model on DVFR. I just wanted to see if there's any other models that you kind of have in your toolkit that you use or you really think are helpful when it comes to organizational change.
Oh golly, well, I mean, I because I so I'm quite agnostic really when it comes to models and things like that. In that, yes, I did ADCAR training, so that's very much not dissimilar to the ACR that we use. It's that starting bit is very much about acknowledgement, and it goes all the way through to actually reinforcing change, which I think is really important. It's kind of like the both ends and everything in the middle. So making sure that it's starting early enough and it goes all the way through. You don't just get to the end of a change project and that's that. It's about making sure that change is being reinforced. And it's the same throughout really, whether it's technical stuff, whether it's the more social behavioral stuff. It really is dependent on what's going on and what's happening in the room. We've been in rooms where we've gone in with an idea of how something might be, and actually it's completely gone out the window, and we've just had to rejig, rethink what we do. So there's no, I don't necessarily have a set way of doing things. I think the good thing about being as old as I am and having lots of different types of experience with different groups of people, different industries, and having different roles is that I've kind of picked up lots of bits and bobs across, a period of time. So yeah, I wouldn't necessarily say that I have a particular go-to. That said, I love ACR. I think the whole, accelerated change readiness approach is brilliant. It works really well. The tactics that I've seen deployed have been, phenomenal. Most notably in our, most recent project, the use of what we called startups to be able to essentially ripple effect change, but at a tailored. It was super tailored. So yes, we've used a group of people to be able to design the work for the organisation. How do we then engage everyone else? The use of these startups through keeping them very specific within their kind of bounded work, making them tailored to that team and using the internal leaders was just phenomenal. I mean, you know the numbers, Day. I can't remember what how many people did we have on those
11,000.
sessions?
Yeah, 11,000 people in the organization. I think about 10,000 went through the startups. I'd have to confirm the numbers, but yes, it was a really what's the word?
Mm,
immersive tactic, really, using those, like you say, those tailored workshops, so that each team were able to come together and think about, what does the future look for me. So touching on what you were saying, that what's in it for me as a team, they were able
mm,
to navigate that, but then also using that space and that forum as a platform to start asking those with them, what's in it for me personally, questions as well. So yeah, completely agree with the importance of sort of ACR tactics that are like that really help people sort of move through that
mm,
change journey. Okay, then. So just thinking, you've sort of talked on some of the models and research and things theoretically, and so I wanted to move the conversation a little bit more to something that was quite sort of tangible
mm,
and practical. And so I think it'd be helpful to hear a little bit about measuring change. So when it comes to measuring change in real life, in the flesh, how does a change leader actually start to measure if and how change is happening on the ground?
mm. Excuse me. So there's a few different things here, and it depends on whether you're talking about the change from the social behaviour point of view or whether you're talking about it from the technical and the system point of view. In that, I mean, first of all, first and foremost, and I talk about this all the time to literally anyone who will listen, and that's the importance of having a baseline. So when you're doing this work, get as much information and data as you can about the organization before you start doing anything. If you've got a good baseline, then you're going to have a better idea of how things are going. And that could be through employee engagement surveys, like the full surveys, and then also the pulse surveys that you might do every 3 or 6 months depending. Those are really useful. It could be, so other things that I've used previously are things like suggestion boxes, which is really, it's super easy. Quite, you can make it as engaging as you want to. The world is your oyster. Cheap to do. So from a financial point of view, you're not having to. There's no great outlay because it can just be an actual box. Obviously, you can do online suggestion type things as well using forms and stuff like that. Those are really useful to be able to, because you can use those for lots of different things. You can use them as a continuous improvement tactic, and just get people to stick in ideas about anything they want, or it can be to do with a specific change that's ongoing. So if you've got a transformation program, it could be that actually you have cards made up or whatever that ask how people are feeling on a 1 to 5 scale or something like that. So I think there's something around employee sentiment and how people are feeling at any given point, which is probably more appropriate when you're in a big program rather than just generally. One of the things I did use in retail actually were like these little screens, and they just had 3 faces on. So they had a green face, green smiley face, a yellow straight line face, and a red angry face. And all you had to do is you went past these screens was just press one and it would log it. And that was quite an interesting way of just capturing what the general feeling was. I mean, obviously, with anything like that, it's kind of swings and roundabouts as to how reliable that is as a kind of data capture. But it was just interesting that you know again, going back to the whole technology thing, there's lots of different ways that you can do this stuff. It doesn't all have to be highly technological, just as it doesn't all have to be highly manual, I guess. So So yeah, so survey suggestion boxes. I'm just trying to think what else. What else, Deo? I mean, things like employee networks actually are really useful, because that's where you have some more kind of specific issues and potential solutions, and also feeds into that diversity and inclusion aspect as well, making sure that actually whatever we're doing it for the whole, we're not doing it for the majority, we're doing it for everyone. And we've actually thought about what the transformation means to people and preempted and tried to mitigate for some of the challenging aspects of that. So there is something about, that. I mean, change advocates, whether you've got, whether it's you've got change, dedicated change managers within the business, that's what they do, or whether you've got, the kind of advocates that do change stuff on the side as an extracurricular activity to their main job. Having those people in the business is really important, because especially if they are more advocates than it's their everyday role, because they can see things from both points of view, and they can help to, they can be quite honest back to project team about what's happening in the business, just as they can act as that conduit between the project and change team and the rest of the workforce. So I think there's something around that. I mean, you can do dedicated specific surveys and questionnaires and things like that around the change itself. And, certainly in the project that we've just finished, we did a lot of kind of quantitative work. So, just your black and white figures, what do you think about the change on are you happy with the change on a scale of 1 to 10, whatever, which is, perfectly reasonable and gives you a very clear, that's where we're at. Equally, things I've done in the past have been focused more on the qualitative side of things. So things like, not so much in the way of interviews, but definitely focus groups I've used a lot, especially in well-being, actually. Focus groups, just to get an idea of how people are feeling about certain things. It's an interesting one, actually, the difference between the qualitative and the quantitative aspects when it comes to collecting data, in that quantitative always has this, it almost feels like it's the gold standard, because it's facts rather than opinions. But I mean, it's not, is it? That, it's still opinions. It's just that you can easily put a number on it without having to kind of analyze it in a bit more depth to kind of pull out your themes and stuff like that. I mean, there's that. It doesn't matter what you use. There's always going to be issues around whether the data that you're getting is valid, whether it is reliable, whether it's accurate. We've all done surveys where we've just gone yep,
Yeah.
and actually not really put that much thought into it. So, that's an interesting one. Actually thinking about, measuring change after the change, I think, is quite an interesting one. So things like change adoption, for example, could be around whether people are using new systems, if they've, logged on to a specific website or whatever it is that they have to do something. Are they being compliant with whatever it is that the change has done? Are they attending training, for example? If there's been some kind of training program because of the change, are they attending it? What are the attendance rates? What are the feedback scores from those training courses? Things like that. It can be really obvious things like test scores. Are people Are people, taking the test to say that they have, developed this knowledge, and are they performing well? And if not, then what needs to be done about that? It could be, observational stuff. Is this what people are seeing within the business? If you've developed a set of leadership behaviors and values that the senior leadership team are going to do their work by and manage the organization by, are people seeing that? Are they observing that they're seeing leaders be more present, be more visible, be more fallible, authentic, whatever it is? Yeah, I'm just trying to think what else. I mean, we've got the kind of standard metrics, like I say. I mean, it could be other things like productivity, for example. So actually, are we seeing productivity increase because of whatever? Are we seeing customer satisfaction scores increase as a result of whatever the change is? If we're trying to be a more operationally excellent organization, then are we seeing that actually our customers are happier and getting a better service? Are our error rates going down because actually we've changed a whole load of stuff, and actually our processes are better, our business outcomes are better? It could be that actually it's things like HR data. So it could be things like attrition. It could be that we're not losing as many people, or it could be that we're actually getting an increased number of people applying for roles because they've been able to actively see the change within the organisation from an outside perspective. So there's an awful lot of things that you can measure. It is difficult. I'm not going to say it's not difficult. It is difficult, but there are a lot of things. But it doesn't. It is easier if you start early.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks, Joe. And so, just I guess to summarize, what I'm really sort of hearing in that is the importance at the beginning, before a change, getting that baseline is really, really important to sort of kick off any sort of change program or transformation program. And then during the change, it's about really getting a sense of, well, what is the sentiment? How are people feeling during the change? And I think here it sounded like there was a lot of qualitative data that or methods that you were referring to, things like focus groups, tapping into the social networks, questionnaires, again, just to really get a feel for how people are feeling as they're going through that change. And then after, it sounds a little bit more like you're sort of touching on some more of those quantitative data pieces as well, with things like HR data, with sort of what are the attendance figures for new training, or what sort of feedback are you getting, what is observable. So no, really, really interesting to start to sort of think about how you measure that as people go through the change. As we start to think about as we continue to think about what happens after the change, and you touched on that idea, I think it was in ADCARS, of reinforcing the change. So when you think about reinforcing change, what have you seen work well when it comes to reinforcing and really helping that change stick?
I mean, there's a few things. So I think celebrating. I mean, celebrating just as a sentence, as an entire sentence, celebrating, I think, is really important. I think it's, especially if it's been a really long time in coming to get to what we would see as the end point from probably our involvement, but actually the start point from the organisation's point of view, of actually, this is now our new way of operating, and we're going to take that forward. I think it's really important to recognise the hard work and the time that has gone into getting to the new state of working, and celebrating those things. If thinking about, some of the metrics we spoke about and the ways to measure adoption, if productivity's increased, if errors have decreased, any of that stuff needs to be celebrated. Equally, if it hasn't, then do something about it, to reinforce it and keep reinforcing it. Leaders are so important throughout all of this. From the beginning, you need that sponsor to be the kind of senior face of the change, and you need that to continue all the way through. So at the end, you need those people to come out and say, we've done a really good job, or actually this wasn't as good as we wanted it to be. So there is an element of leaders needing to be visible and present, and be honest and authentic and things like that. One of the most powerful things I ever saw was it was an HR director, and she was the only woman in the senior leadership team, which is a difficult position anyway. But she came out, and she not admitted, that's not the right word, but she did say that she really struggled with imposter syndrome, and that was probably the single most powerful thing I've ever seen a senior leader do, because it was a very male driven environment. It was so it was retail, but it was home improvement. So very male driven, very male dominated. And she came in and was like brilliant at just saying, this is something that I struggle with. And being able to be that vulnerable was really helpful. And I think, as well as celebrating things, I think sometimes people want to see that, these what people perceive to be these infallible leaders, get stuff wrong as well. Or they have to deal with tricky circumstances or whatever. And I think being able to display that and show that is really important. So that's a huge thing. One of the things that we did within that same environment were these town halls, and it was really nice because it was all kind of as face to face as possible. And the leaders would kind of get up on this little makeshift stage and be very kind of open about what had gone well, what hadn't gone so well, what the challenges were, and what was going to happen next, and things like that. Rather than, there's that. I say, you want to celebrate everything, but you have to temper that with being honest about the things that didn't go so well as well. So that's always worked well. One of the best things I ever saw, which when I first got involved and thought about the plan for this, I thought this is not going to work, but it did, and it was really good. And it was a funeral. We held a funeral for the old operating model. It kind of turned into a bit of a celebration. It's like a wake rather than a funeral, I guess. And it was really, again, as humans, we love rituals. We love a bit of pomp and circumstance and ceremony, and it was a really good way. We got a couple of objects that were very much the old co, and we had a couple of things like an old structure chart, and just some old ways of working and things like that, and we essentially burnt them. And it was just a really, it was seen as being quite light-hearted and a little bit silly, but actually it had a really huge positive impact in that people were quite literally burning the old so that they could move on with the new. And I was in two minds initially. I thought, is this going to work? But it really did. And actually, one thing I have found is that you actually can be quite out there with some ideas, and they will, more often than not, come off really well. We did a play last summer with our previous client, and it was none of us were involved. The client basically put on a play to whoever happened to be wandering by, And the play was about what had happened so far in the transformation program, and it was brilliant. And you got senior leaders involved, you got people all the way down to work level one involved. So it was the whole cross spectrum of people in the organization who were putting themselves on show to explain something to everyone else. And it was just one of those really awesome moments where you see people doing something they wouldn't normally do, but getting such a great response, like back, that it just worked really, really well, and to the point where I've actually recommended it as an activity for another client now. So I'll let you know how that
Love
goes.
that. I love that. That's great. That's great to just sort of hear some of your reflections on that, and just even sort of touching on the leader's roles. Going back to what you were saying about the leader's role, about the importance of them being vulnerable, like the lady that you'd seen, or being sort of open and honest and about what they were experiencing, but also what was happening in the business as the change was going ahead. Is there anything else that you think needs to be sort of called out or said around the leadership role during times of change?
Um, I mean, it's hard. It is hard being a leader anyway. It's especially hard being a leader in change because, especially if you know that you might potentially be doing yourself out of a job. It's hard to excuse me. It's hard to kind of keep that in mind while still trying to do the best for the organisation. I think there's a lot around leadership style and things like that. I think I would always encourage there to be a conversation within the leadership cohort, whatever level that is, whether that's the top level or level -1. I would always encourage there to be a conversation as a group to work through their joint expectations, the way that they work together and are seen as an entity by the rest of the business. So one of the things that we worked on previously, Deo, as you know, was we did a set of orientation sessions for leaders so that they could spend time within their individual cohorts. One, getting to know each other because not everyone had worked together previously. I think sometimes we take it for granted that all the leaders know each other, which isn't the case, especially in huge organisations. We're talking about 11, 12,000 people. So making sure that they know each other and they spend time getting to know each other and working out what their differences are and what their preferences are, and being able to explain things and work together, noting their differences and their preferences. I think there's something around the positive impact of having a team charter, which whenever I had a conversation would go down like a lead balloon. There'd be raised eyebrows, eye rolls all over the place, but not a single session where we did any kind of team chartering, not a single session did anyone come out at the end of it and say, well, that was a waste of time, because it was a really good opportunity for everyone to outline exactly what their expectations were and use that as a set of guidelines for whenever they're meeting in future to actually make sure that they are adhering to that and creating an environment that is psychologically safe for them to be able to have some of the more difficult conversations around difference of opinion, whether it's conflict, any kind of challenging issues. They had already done some of the hard work to be able to better have those conversations simply by defining a list of how they would work together, and within meetings make sure use it as a checklist. Have we all listened to each other? Have we all had our say? Really simple stuff, but by noting them and almost agreeing to it, signing the piece of paper, it keeps all of those people within that cohort accountable for maintaining that behavior and empowers everyone to wave a flag if actually they're not seeing that. And I think that having that tight knit community that leads the rest of the organization is vital, because that's what everyone else is going to see. You know, if they're seeing rifts or a difference of opinion, or even if it's just those offhand comments, that's what will undermine what they're trying to do. So, leadership's super important. And, whilst I didn't enjoy the work that I did at the time when I worked in leadership, as I said earlier, it has come in so, it's been so useful now to be able to help those leadership teams communicate with each other, communicate with their direct reports. And, you can tell the cohorts that have spent that time together and come out as one in public. They might disagree behind closed doors, but if they come out of that boardroom as one unit, that's what makes it work.
No, I love that. I love that because there's even that contrast in what we've been talking about that says, actually, it's about that sort of individual human person level. What I'm hearing when it comes to leadership, especially, is the importance of them showing up as a team, as one unit, as opposed to just an individual sort of plowing their own path. So, no, really, really, really love that. You touched on a word that's very popular, and I'd just love to hear some of your thoughts around it when it comes to psychological safety. Yeah, any thoughts or that you have around psychological safety when it comes to organizational change? It'd be great to hear that.
Interesting. Yes, it is very much a popular concept at the moment. I'm not quite sure what to say. I mean, obviously, I think it's one of these things, a bit like resilience as a term that you hear a lot about and don't necessarily. I don't know whether sometimes it gets overused and sometimes it doesn't. So I think the concept of psychological safety is incredibly important, because it's for all levels. It's not just a I know I used it in the context of the leadership team, but it should be for everyone. Anyone should feel comfortable to be able to make a comment, make a suggestion, whether it's a positive idea, whether it's a complaint, whatever it is, should be able to feel comfortable enough to use their voice in the workplace. And that almost be the end of it. There's no retaliation or negative result or anything like that from making a comment. So it is important. It feels like it should be easy to develop and nurture, but I don't think it is. I think a lot of it rests on the more senior person within a group of people to be able to role model it. I think if your most senior person can be and demonstrate their own vulnerability and be authentic, then it makes it a lot easier for other people to feel like they have permission to do the same. But that in itself isn't easy, and it's not something that everyone wants to do either. Some people don't want to talk about, they want to keep work and life separate, and that's absolutely fine. Some people are happy to bring in their kind of life and personal aspects into their work and professional world. I think I'm probably a little bit of an idealist, in that I would love for everyone to feel like they can bring themselves to work and do the best work that they can. But that might not be the realist view. Yeah, it's an interesting one. One of the things I worked on previously, though, was actually something called psychological capital rather than psychological safety, which is more of a positive psychology model that I worked on when I did the postgraduate certificate, and it's around individuals,
Mm.
and it's around addressing certain aspects that is really hard to explain. I kind of wish I hadn't gone down this road now, but it 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 hinges on four different aspects. So hope, efficacy or self-efficacy, resilience, and optimism to do their best work.
Mm.
And if managers and leaders can work on their own psychological capital, and they can enable other people to work on their own psychological capital, then there will be a much happier workforce.
Mm.
And that's especially important in change because it hinges on all of those things that I just said. So it's about the hope for the future. It's
Mm.
about efficacy or self-efficacy around being able to, having the confidence in their own ability to be able to
Mm.
do the things they want to do.
Yeah.
Resilience, which I know I said earlier, but resilience to be able to, sometimes take a bit of a kicking and carry
Mm.
on. And that isn't a byword for keep throwing stuff at people
Yeah.
at all. But it is about being able to cope with those challenges and, learn from them and move on. And then optimism about attributing the good things not just to external events but to internal events as well.
Mm.
It's you didn't do well at that thing because you were lucky. You did
Mm.
well at the thing because you put the effort in, you put the time in to do the research and the preparation or whatever it is. And I think I could wax lyrical about this for ages, I'm
Mm.
sorry. I think developing psychological capital within individuals and teams and organisations more broadly is super important. And I would do a whole podcast on that.
Yeah, definitely. Let's plan to do that. That sounds so fascinating. I'd love to have another conversation with you all about that. I think what we sort of touched on, or what you touched on, even in that context of social capital, is the leadership role. And I love hearing about the leadership roles and responsibility when it comes to driving, navigating, supporting people in change. I'm also really fascinated by an individual's ability to do that, or a network's ability to do that. So I think it'd be good to hear from you just any thoughts about what you think would be helpful at an individual level. So someone that maybe isn't a leader, but you touched on earlier about sort of networks. Any thoughts around individuals and networks at all when it comes to change?
Yeah, I mean, I think any kind of like peer
Mm.
support is really useful, and that again, that's at any level. And I know I mentioned about like employee networks earlier. So those are, generally speaking, we would see them in organisations for protected characteristics. And I think, I mean, I love them. I think they're great. They're such a good resource for people. Excuse me, a good resource for people to have support within the workplace and to help drive change within the workplace as well. Whether it's policies, whether it's I mean, you name it. But any kind of network, whether it's one of the kind of established ones around gender or race or sexuality or whatever it is, I think they're obviously great. I think any kind of network whereby you are engaging with other people, you're sharing ideas, anything like that is really, really helpful. And another a good example of that might be a change advocate network. And
Mm.
actually, just because they're a change advocate doesn't mean they work in isolation and only speak to one person or whatever. Actually, them as a group themselves can have their own network and learn from each other. And I think that's the same across the board, really, in terms of having those kind of peer-to-peer networks, and even things like reverse mentoring, for example,
Mm.
would be a really, really useful kind of way to be able to not tick some of those boxes, but to address some of those things as well. I'm trying to think. Yeah, I mean anything where people are speaking to each other, sharing ideas, shooting the breeze, as I like to say, I think is a really useful thing. And from a well-being point of view, it's meaning that people are having, positive work relationships as well, and that's, you know so important in reducing things like loneliness and isolation at work, which are, you know sounds a little bit overkill, but they are killers. They result in, mental and physical distress, and that's not what we want. And so, if we can get more people, talking to each other about anything, then I think that's a good thing.
That's great. Thanks so much, Joe. We are coming to the end of our conversation now, and it's been so, so insightful. I've really loved hearing that sort of journey of change and how change has changed. We touched on a little bit about how to measure change before, during, and after. We've reflected a little bit on the leadership roles and sort of coming to sort of talk about the individual or the network's role. And the thing that's really stood out to me in this is that thing we started off with, which is the importance of it being human centered. So as we close, I wanted to know if you could finish us off with maybe one key takeaway that you would like to leave our listeners with. What would that be?
Just one. um
As many as you want.
um I think there's probably two things. One is about communicating. So one is just communication, blanket communication, talk to people. Whether you are a leader trying to manage change, just communicate with people. Use your peers, use your network. And the other one is, be curious. Ask questions. Ask the kind of challenging questions around, if we're talking about a transformation or a change program. Ask the questions, because I guarantee 90% of the people around you want to know the same thing, and aren't quite brave enough to ask a question. So yeah, communicate, be curious. I think with that, have an open mind as well. Change is scary, but it's inevitable. And if you can go into it with an open heart and an open mind, then it's likely to be a much easier journey.
Yeah. So true. Love that. Love the little bit of alliteration at the end as well there too. Thank you so much again, Joe, for your time. And thank you so much to our listeners. If you found today's episode helpful, be sure to follow us, like the content, and share with a colleague. Until next time, take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you for tuning in. Please subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform and tune in next time for another engaging conversation on everything operating model and org design. Take care.